Here's the science of what keeps your water cold in an Owala bottle. So imagine if I cut this bottle in half, what would you see? So let me draw a picture of what that would look like. So it would look like something like this. So just going to draw the bottle, and then there is another layer inside the bottle. Okay, so you have two layers, and these layers are both stainless steel. So you have an inner layer, I'll call that inner, and then you have an outer layer, okay? Now, in between those layers, you have an empty space, okay? So we'll just call it space, okay? And that space is vacuum sealed. So what does that mean? That means that there's no air inside that empty space, okay? And like in here is where your water is. So I'm going to write water, and that is where your water is stored and stays cold. First, let's talk a little bit about science. This will help you understand why they designed the bottle this way. So let's talk about heat transfer. Now, there are three different types of heat transfer. One is called conduction. So conduction means when an object has direct contact to heat. So imagine a pot. So I'm drawing a pot, and that pot is on a stove. That pot has direct contact to the heat. That's called conduction. If you put your hand directly on the stove, that is also called conduction because it is direct contact with the stove. So that means you have direct contact with the heat. The other type of heat transfer, which is indirect contact, that means you have no contact to the heat source, that is called radiation. But this type of radiation is thermal radiation or heat radiation. It's not the same radiation like from an X-ray machine. The sun also produces thermal radiation. So the sun light is radiating heat that you can feel. A campfire also radiates heat. If you put your hand near a stove without touching it, that's also radiation that you can feel the heat. The last heat transfer I would like to talk about is called convection. With convection, heat is transferred either through a liquid or a gas. So in a boiling pot of water, you have two types of heat transfer going on. You have conduction, which is the stove making contact with the pot, so that heats up the pot through conduction. Since the water does not have direct contact to the heat, which is the stove, that's called convection, and the water circulates within the pot. So if you put food inside that water, let's say an egg, that egg is cooking through what you call convection, which is it receives the heat through the water. So that type of convection is through liquid. Now, the other type of convection is through a gas or air. Have you ever heard of a convection oven or an air fryer? Well, those use heating elements, but it also has a fan that circulates that air. So when you put food inside an air fryer, the food does not have direct contact with the heating element. It has contact with the air that circulates through the air fryer to heat up your food. That's called convection. Another example of convection is a hairdryer. So inside a hairdryer, there's a heating element, and then there's a fan that blows the air past that heating element, and that's what heats up the air, and the air dries your hair. That's also a form of convection. So let's get back to the Owala bottle and its design. So remember, we have an outer layer, an inner layer, and then in between those layers, there's an empty space that's vacuum sealed, and there's no air inside. So for conduction is not possible for the inner layer because a heat source cannot make contact with the inner layer. And for the inner layer, radiation is not possible for the sun because the sun has to shine, but it only hits the outer layer and it can't make contact with the inner layer. But here's the real magic. So if the sun is shining on the outer layer may heat up, but then you have this vacuum sealed space that's in between both layers. There's no air in there, which means heat can't transfer to the inner layer if there's no air in there to transfer it, which means convection is not possible since there's no air inside this space. So that is the science behind this Owala bottle. But there's a couple of things I want to talk about to keep the water cold. So let's talk about the lid. So inside the lid, there's a rubber gasket. And what that gasket does is when you put the lid on, it creates a seal inside the bottle. And what that seal does, it keeps the warm air from getting in and the cold air from getting out. And that's what keeps your water cold. And another thing about the lid, so if you open this up, inside the lid, there's this rubber piece here, a gasket, and if you see the shape here, it's the same shape as the opening here and here. So what that does, it seals the bottle. So if you want to keep your water cold, you want to keep this lid closed, because that's what keeps it sealed, and that's what keeps the warm air from getting in and the cold air from getting out. I hope you found this information helpful, information about the Owala bottle, and maybe this information will help you decide if this is the water bottle for you.